All right, I was asked to do a screencast looking at some sample writing. Uh, so those students that have volunteered for this, thank you for allowing us to have this opportunity to further calibrate some of our writing as we prepare for the writing expectation U.S. History honors. So I will read through these. I haven't read through these in their entirety, so it's kind of just letting you know what's going on in my thought process as I read this. Okay, so the topic here is generations. Generations are separated by loosely based birth years and or events and ideas that a group of people experience. They are named after a culture identifier or sequential order. Baby boomers receive their name from the increase. All right, so there's a couple things going on here. I would say like these are two different things. Writing about how generations are created, like their name, is one thing, but then now you're getting into baby boomers and Gen Z, and I would say baby boom and Gen Z. That's a big jump. I mean, there are millennials and 13ers in there, so I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there seems to be a jump here, so I would say that this definitely needs to be clarified. What are you writing about? Each generation is made of people who tend to have birth years in and around that same time period. Okay, but the prompt was asking you, how do they get their name? Like, how does that name get developed? What are those characteristics and those traits? Do they play any role in influencing? For example, the silent generation, they get that name silent as a result of them being born at a certain time where there was no war, and so the isolationist attitude in the United States where we were taking a backseat to international affairs. It's part of the reason why they get that particular name. Anyway, because they are born around the same time, they all go through the same experience that mold them to have the same perspective about society. Once there is a change that causes a newer group of people to differ from the way people thought, a new generation begins from. I don't know how this supports either of these two. I guess possibly this section here. Kurt Mask has wrote in his review of one of his studies, examines generational stereotypes. Gen X grew up in a period that saw great advances in technology. All right, so this source seems to support the point here that the student is trying to make. It's like he's saying this supports this point. No, this one here, because he's getting specific about it. But why would you mention Generation X? Generation X isn't even here, so you can't even use this Generation Y. Like, why would you even bother citing anything about Gen X and Gen Y if you never even mentioned them here? Like, there seems to be a huge disconnect with that source, which is what I'm going to be doing. I'm looking at that source and then I'm trying to figure out, does this source match up, line up with the thesis? And I would say no. Both of them view the world differently. Like, is this what you're writing about? Are you writing about how generations view the world differently? Because if you are, it's not here. So why bother bringing that up at all? So again, Generation X is growing up in a time period. So those would be some of the main issues that I have with this. Which thesis are you writing about? Your evidence isn't really matching up. There does seem to be a little attempt to, analyze, which means the analysis. You use the source, and then this section here, you're supposed to be explaining in your writing how the source supports the thesis here. Like, that's what you should be doing there. So there does seem to be an attempt there, but I would say this seems to be way off with regard to those issues. There's some major issues here on that one. Let's go to the next one. Mass murder Andrew committed can be considered to be an act of terrorism because he killed 40 innocent lives present game because of his disregard for human life. The bombing occurred because of Andrew's mental. All right, so they're trying to argue that Kehoe's acts of the school bathhouse are terroristic. So there's two sentences. It should just be one. And I would say use the definition. Andrew Kehoe's, school bathhouse massacre, whatever you want to call it, because if you're going to call it terrorist, then you're going to have to support that, is or is not terrorist. Because, I would just say you could argue this one because of his mental instability. Like, I'm just saying historically, I would say like that right there would be something that I just know. Like, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking he's got more, or she has more of an opportunity to prove this point. There's a lot in this thesis. Innocent lies for personal gain. They're not using the definition of terrorism. Nurtured by his traumatic life events. Like, that might even count there. And if you're going to say he was more of he was not a terrorist because he was mental unstable and because of traumatic life events, to me that seems to be more of a better route to go. Let's see what he argues, or she. Andrew Kehoe's mental instability was formed from his child and nurtured in his adulthood. All right, so he kind of jumping right into this. In Bad School, the author talks about Andrew Kehoe's childhood. Throughout the article, Madison explains that in Kehoe's early life, he has faced many traumatizing incidents which help solidify. All right, so there seems to be some direction about these points here, but it's not clear in the thesis. So this definitely needs to be, touched up to address that point. They should only be saying, "Yep, all my thesis is about are these points right here: mental unstable and traumatic life events." For an occurrence from his child was the death of Andrew's mother, which he witnessed for himself without being able to help. Okay, so what does that have to do with his act of terrorism or not? Memorial Kehoe tried to save his stepmother by throwing a bucket of water on her. So it doesn't seem to be any attempt. I mean, the prompt is asking, okay, is this an example of terrorism or not? And you could constantly keep going back to that definition of terrorism. It's not terroristic because he has no political motive. This is more about him being mentally unstable, and using maybe this example here. I don't know where this source comes from. So this is coming from, I don't know, Bath School Massacre. Is this a book? Let's see. I don't know. Let's see what this comes up at. Let's see. So I'm assuming. Okay, so it's coming up to that. All right. Listen to this. He could have. So by Andrew witnessing this, he could have become more mentally. So here, this is a big assumption. You're assuming that. Like what evidence do you have? I would say cite your evidence. You need evidence, to support that particular point. I want to say students did find the autopsy report on this, event here, and maybe that's something that could play into this, or no, maybe not. I think that's something that happened in the '60s for the second essay. Anyway, another contributing factor to his insanity is the fact that when he was attempting to stay, he only made it far worse, rendering his attempt useless. So this again seems to be an assumption. And I would say, well, what evidence do you have? What evidence do you have? And again, like if the topic is terrorism, what does this have to do with terrorism? I would say like that would be something that I would want to address. Like, if it's terroristic, you have to have a political, motive. The student here doesn't seem to keep going back to that point. It was not terroristic because, of the issues that you're mentioning here. Like that would be a better approach. Looks like we're going into something else here. So I'm going to move that down. All right, let's go to the next one. Key figures like Margaret Sanger. So I like that. Key figures. Maybe you give me a date. When are we writing about? Date. Like Margaret Sanger spearheaded the women's rights movement by fighting for basic reproductive rights. So is there a difference between women's rights movement and reproductive rights? And 1920s, is women's rights about voting or is it about reproductive rights? Maybe you don't need this. Maybe you do. I don't know. Fighting for basic reproductive rights. And I put here how. Well, how did they fight? That could be a thesis within itself. Margaret Sanger fought for reproductive rights by, treatment of abortion and the use of contraceptive pills. I don't know exactly what they mean here, but treatment of abortion, you would probably have to break that down. And use of contraceptive, like was she handing out contraceptive pills? Was she performing abortion? Because then that could be it right there. During the 1920s, key figures from the abortionist movement, 1920s, something like that, like Margaret Sanger, fought for reproductive rights by distributing contraceptive pills and whatever else. Like that would be a way to go here. Let's read. As a young child, Margaret Sanger had to witness her mother's deterioration from the consequence of 18 pregnancies, 7 of them being miscarriages, and her until eventually perished at the young age of 48. I don't know what that has to do with this. Could be off topic. Is this more of a bio on Margaret Sanger? Because if it is, trying to get into like what she felt and what motivated her, and maybe it works. I don't know, but I don't get that from this thesis that it's really about just like, what motivated Margaret Sanger to be the movement, the abortionist, rights activist that she was. I would say you'd have to change that thesis. I don't necessarily know, but again, it's just the first sentence. This gay Sanger, so here we have an assumption to decide that she did not want to end up like her mother. Like I would say, like, well, how do you know that? Well, how do you know that? You know that to be true. So that would be like my question there. Trapped in a position where she had absolutely no control of her own body, become a nurse and moved to New York. Seems like a real summary bio. Like, where is your argument? Like, what did she do? You're arguing that she did these things. I'm saying, like, there's just too much bio here. Like, you probably can cut this down in half. 2 sentences. Margaret Sanger is demonstrating leadership and legacy. So here we have an introduction of the source, which is, what I'm looking for here. And Margaret Sanger demonstrating leadership and legacy. So that's the name of the article. Here's the author. Good. Like you should be doing it. I want you introducing your sources. I don't know if I messed up the student's response here, because it looks like I just, it was, they indented here. And I would say if they indented, that might be too short. But no, they have this whole section. So that could justify, indenting this because it does seem to be lengthy here. I would say if it was 1 or 2 sentences, maybe you can just give me those 2 sentences, no need to indent. But this looks okay. Maybe let's see. All right. So Caroline has rights. Margaret Sanger began her career as a nurse in New York City. Sanger predominantly cared for women from the lower class without conscious value. Became apparent she treated women who were relieved of stillbirth. All right. So it's interesting because they're not talking about the bio here. But then they give me this yellow section that's primarily about Margaret Sanger's life. And I'm thinking, well, that's kind of off topic in relation to the thesis. But then they're bringing this issue up here. So they're kind of like this section here does kind of support the yellow here. So I would say like the student probably needs more than 3 sources here, because I'm looking for clear support of this thesis. And if they don't have it, there's going to be an issue. So this source, I would say, somewhat supports that thesis. I don't necessarily know that it clearly does. Or shows Sanger saw it's unaffordable and Planned Parenthood recurring and wrote like again, like this is looking at the motive. This is the motive. Like this is what's motivating her. Just change the thesis to like say that. Like this is what motivated Margaret Sanger to do the things she did. And then this kind of works. I would say here, as at this point, it doesn't seem to be a direct connection between this source and this thesis. I like the introduction. I like the little intro on Sanger. I would just say it's inappropriate or off topic with this thesis. So you either change the thesis or you're going to have to give me more than this source here. Because if this is one source out of the 3 minimum, I'm going to probably score this at the lowest and say, yeah, you don't really have a source. So this student has some options here. Change the thesis, give me more sources that support this thesis. That's what I'm looking for. Let's go on to the next one. Charles Lindbergh flew the first transatlantic flight in 27 and succeeded due to drastically reducing the weight of the plane by choosing to keep flight essential to remove additional items and maintain space for fuel. I would say it seems kind of wordy. You can probably cut that down. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh's first transatlantic flight was successful because he drastically reduced the weight of the plane, and additional items, and then maybe that becomes your point. Like I don't know. I mean, that might work. Right? I don't want to try to reduce some of these sentences. I mean, the more you write in a thesis, the more questions I now have. Anyway, Lindbergh's initiative to remove all things he deemed unnecessary. Like, there's no quick intro. It just kind of like gets into this. Like, all right, I'm getting right into what this guy did. So it's weird because over here, there needs to be too much bio. Maybe 1 or 2 sentences. Like, give me something, about the time period. In the 1920s, air flight was in its infancy. I don't know. Maybe give me 1 or 2 things about what was going on in aviation in the 1920s, and then transition to Lindbergh. As Lindbergh's initiative to remove, like I don't know what initiative means. They're explaining it here. So essentials, he was able to remove simpler things like the seats of a plane without too much thought. And I'm thinking, well, why? Why is he doing any of this? And again, if you have a quick intro up here that kind of addresses, the complexities in aviation, the problems and dilemmas, then maybe that's a good transition. I would think, oh, up here he's talking about how this was problematic and weight and fuel, and now they're addressing, and now, Lindbergh's removing the seats for that reason. But he had to think harder about how to remove. Like, how do you know he's thinking harder? Like, what's your source on that? How do you know that? You know, is this about Lindbergh? You know, what Lindbergh thought? I don't know. So again, I think like a lot of this is just filler info. That's what I would say. This seems to be a lot of filler. Like you're just trying to fill a quota. According to Lindbergh, in a New York Times interview, you know, maybe you want to underline this. We're talking about newspaper. Laymen have had a great deal of effect. I don't know what that means. Layman, like layman. Are we talking about somebody? Layman? I don't know. I could look that up. Layman. All right. Anyway, I sail without a navigator, without the ordinary stock of navigation instruments, but my real drive was the earth inductor compass. I replaced navigator's weight. Okay, well, why is he doing this? So he kind of like jumped the gun here. Like, here's what he's doing. All right, well, why? Why? Like this right here, like there seems to be no flow. And when you look at the rubric, there's a section that reads flow. Like, you know, there are different styles of writing, you know, historical, you know, essays and books. You know, some people have more of a narrative style where they're trying to tell a story. This lacks a story. It seems to be like, I'm just going to jump right into what this guy did, but I don't really have any historic context, historic understanding. So I'm left to kind of ask questions in my head as I read this. Like, what are these laymen? What was aviation like? Um, I get what they're doing here. Like, this source does kind of address the point here, but I'm kind of lost in the explanation or like, you know, what's going on in this 1920s. So again, like there has to be a balance between what was done here um, and what was done here. But I think in this one, like, I don't know, I think I need more of this one. I kind of have faith that this is going to have, you know, more sources there. All right, anyway. Everywhere where I was going, Lindbergh replaced the traditional navigation with an earth inductor compass. This compass provided him with more space for fuel since it was much more compact, and it also performed extraordinarily well on his journey. His decision to use the compass ended up being a win-win situation. So this is slang. Like his decision to use the compass, what was that based on? And it kind of goes back to my point before about aviation. Like, you know, what's going on with that? Like, if I was grading this, I would probably be like, you know, what is going on here? Like, why are you including this? I'm kind of lost in some of the, you know, the sequence of events. Let's get to the next. According to Lindbergh in his autobiography, failure with the multi-engine plane increased proportionally with the number of engines used. When people talked about the safety game by having more than one engine, it's like this source right here is probably better earlier. You know, tell me about these engines, these multi-engines earlier up here, and then get into the fact that this guy, you know, he's reducing weight by reducing some of these aviation things. Like that would be, I think, a better structure for this one to kind of, you know, give me something to kind of work with, show me some sort of historical progression. All right, let's go on. We got one more here. During World War I, the New York Times from 1915 to 1917 focused more on sunken ships, shark attacks, and feminists than on the Armenian genocide from the years 1915 to 17. Whew, all right, this is going to be difficult. The New York Times wrote hundreds of articles from 1915 to 1917, ranging from the Lusitanian Nervy story of Alice Paul's woman activities in the Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide was the time Armenians were targeted by Turkish officials, so they're giving me some sort of history. I don't like was a time. I don't like that. Targeted by Turkish officials. According to, you know, all right, so like, why are you transitioning to this source? I think there needs to be one more sentence here that kind of, you know, prepares me for this. According to 800,000 Armenians counted destroyed, Viscount Bryce tells House of Lords that it is probable number of Turk victims. So I don't get why this source is here. This article wrote of how, so you don't want to do this. You know, just do it. Like, you don't want to say this source does this or this reading does that. No, don't do that. Just, you know, get into supporting the point. They've provided me with a source here. That's what's going on. They're giving me this source. The article wrote of how many Armenians live. You know, keep in mind, they're supposed to be arguing here about those shark attacks and those other things, that we're more concerned about these issues as opposed to this issue. I put that you cited that a first source doesn't contradict your thesis. Place later. If he computes this since last 8 men, women, and children have been slain in cold blood in Asia Minor. More than 750,000 Armenians have been killed, and yet a year from 15, only 32 articles were written in New York Times versus the 72 that were written with the span of a month. All right, so this is actually pretty interesting here. So as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, well, how is this student really supporting this point? Like I don't think I would have used this approach here. I'm trying to figure out. Wanted to insert something, but oh right, whatever. It's not off shape. That's what I wanted to do. Like more than three-quarters have been killed. Where is that? Less than 2,000. Where was it? Only 32 articles were written in the New York Times versus 72 that were written within the span of 1 month about the RMS Lusitania. Like this section right here, they're really supporting that point. I think that they, how do I make this transparent? Is that the way I do it? Here we go. Yeah, I don't know what to say here because this clearly does address the point, but it doesn't. I don't know that this is needed. Like I almost would say, I would probably put this section earlier and then transition. You know, I don't know, like that 800,000 Armenians are counted destroyed. Like that's horrific. But they're trying to prove this point that more than three-quarters, like they could even go the route of listing these article titles. Like you could probably use that and say, look, here's an article, shark attack kills human or Jersey resident. And then like, look at this article. I would be more concerned about this. Like, why are they not reporting this? That then would be an assumption. But they do have that the 70, like that's amazing that the student actually knows that in that time frame that's the difference. They almost can give me a graph. Like I would be totally fine in this case with the student coming up with some sort of chart or something like this and put shark attack, shark stories. I just spelled that wrong. What's going on? Did I do that? I don't even know what's going on. I would put Armenians, and then I would probably put what with the other women, and then I would put like the name, like that. Well, not the name, like the amount. And now you're using like data to argue that point. Less than 2,000 people died on a second ship. So I guess what they're going with here is they're saying, well, look, yeah, less than 2,000 people died. That is nowhere in comparison to the 800,000 people dead here. To me, then that's a different essay. Like it's a comparison. It's almost like this is reading like an op-ed. Like I think for the student to just support this point here, I would just address the points that they have this. Like I expect to see more of this section circled. And then all of the other assumptions and the op-ed stuff like, oh, look, it's terrible. 800,000 Armenians are dead and less than 2,000 people died on the Lusitania. They have more articles about the Lusitania than they do about this. Like that's the thesis. That's what this student here needs to write about. All right.